Hi everyone, my name is Upulie Divisekera and I'm delighted to be here as part of the Finding Ada Conference 2021, and I'm really honoured to have been invited to speak, so thank you for having me. So today I'd like to talk about something that's quite dear to my heart, and that is access to science. Because I believe, I know that science is for everyone. You know, science isn't something done by remote geniuses and in these isolated ivory towers away from the rest of the world and society. Science is a process, it's a method and a philosophy all in one, and it's done by people for people. So this talk is going to be a brief introduction to reaching out through social media and specifically through Twitter to increase access to science and to better inform the public about the kinds of research that we do. So first I'll be talking about science communication and how to use Twitter to build a profile, and why use Twitter when there are other social media platforms available. And so why Twitter is particularly good for science communication and for your career. And I'll also be talking about something else that's dear to me, which is increasing representation and diversity of scientists, which is part of the project that I co-founded called Real Scientists. So first, the big question: why communicate science? Well, you know, as scientists, we are mostly funded by the public, and the public deserves to know where their research money is going and what it's doing for them. And the other thing is that with this investment, they also have the right, and they deserve, to be science literate. And it's also really important that we have widespread science literacy and critical thinking skills in the populace, because we're living in an era of pandemics, of catastrophic climate change, antibiotic resistance, and the influence of technology in every aspect of our lives, from being able to turn off your lights to how your data is stored, and whether you can use a VPN to watch Great British Bake Off on Netflix. So because of this, because of all of these pressures, and as you can see, particularly in this pandemic, reaching out to non-scientists and engaging with them and working with them is more important than ever. So with all of these challenges, it's particularly important to make sure that we reach out to people and increase science literacy. Although in many ways, science has also never been more popular, and quite a few studies have shown that there's actually quite a high level of trust in scientists, and that can go up to, I think, about 60%. And scientists are now celebrities. For example, people will pay to see Professor Brian Cox in solo shows. People go to science at the pub nights, and not just scientists and grad students will go. And there's also an increasing number of science festivals and nights at the museum that people are keen to go to. So your audience is out there, the enthusiasm is out there. It's perhaps more that people aren't sure how to get there or to be made aware. The other thing, I guess, is that a lot of these people are already invested in science. Many of the people who turn up to these events are already invested in science. They're already science fans. So the really big challenge for us is, how do we reach people who are a little bit more shy when it comes to science, people whose experience of science is perhaps limited to some unpleasant and quite dull experiments in high school chemistry or science classes, and they haven't had a chance to kind of see the incredible beauty and complexity of science, which kind of describes the beauty and complexity of the world around us. So really our ultimate goal in science communication is to reach people who don't normally keep up with science. Now, this is actually the really big question in science communication. And believe me, I don't have a single simple answer for that. But this is one way of approaching it in trying to get people from non-traditional audiences interested. And we have an urgent need to not just create a better informed public, but to break down the perceived barriers between scientists and non-scientists, and also who can be a scientist. We need to encourage people to participate in science, in citizen science projects, and also to encourage people to get into science if they want to. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll talk about it a bit more when I talk about real scientists. So we really need to get the message out there that science is for everyone. How do we reach these people? Well, my recommendation, as you can imagine, is to join Twitter. And you might be asking the question, why use Twitter as your main form of science communication? And well, I'd say that not only is Twitter primarily text-based and kind of allows you to play with words in a way that you can't necessarily do on other mediums, but you can actually post videos and GIFs and so on and so forth. But it's really the immediacy of Twitter that is really appealing. Now, personally, I became interested in using Twitter around 2010 or so, and there were all sorts of things happening around the world, and it turned out that Twitter was a really great breaking news service. And the thing with Twitter is that it's an extremely dynamic environment where there are hundreds of thousands of millions of people feeding into this massive stream. And you can carve out a little corner in that stream, or you can send your thought out into that stream. You can send your science communication out into that stream. And its immediacy means that something that you say can be retweeted and go around the world and interest people in science in a way that is a little trickier to do with other platforms. So it's the real immediacy of Twitter that makes it so appealing, and the fact that it will allow a whole range of different kinds of communication. I mean, when I joined Twitter, it was to follow the news because of what was happening around the world. And it became this important source for breaking news. So what's really interesting is that over time, it's also become a source for breaking science news. And this means that scientists can actually directly comment on papers or news stories. People can ask more details about them. And so that is something that you can do in real time. And it also allows us to do things like watch a SpaceX launch, to watch various launches, Mars rovers landing and helicopters being released that we just weren't able to do before. And you can have a little watch party about it. You can watch it online together, and you can also learn from the scientists who might actually be working at NASA on the project. And that's something that's really quite remarkable about Twitter. The other thing about Twitter, of course, is that well, you know, a lot of people, a lot of different kinds of people that you wouldn't normally be able to easily speak to or contact are on Twitter. Politicians are on Twitter, journalists are on Twitter, other scientists are on Twitter. And so you can speak directly to these people. You can speak directly to politicians if you like. You may or may not get an answer, and the same goes for journalists, but it gives you a level of access that you previously would not have been able to achieve. And so that's one of the really great things about Twitter. The other thing about Twitter is that it's, because of its character limits, it forces you to really consider how you can turn a difficult scientific concept, a complicated concept, into language language that people can understand at the everyday, using everyday language at the everyday level, but without dumbing it down. So in doing so, you'll find that you become a better science communicator, but you also become a better scientist, because it forces you to really think about your research, because you do have to describe it in a way that's a little bit simpler, but not simplified. So Twitter is kind of a unique medium. The other thing about Twitter is, as I said before, you can contribute to this mass sort of timeline of streaming thoughts, but you can capture people's attention that way as well. So you can, people might notice something scientific that they'd never noticed before, and like parasite-infected snails are particularly popular. No one ever gets tired of them, however disgusting they are. And the same goes for cordyceps, which is the zombie fungus. So people love this stuff, and now they're practically memes, and people know the names of different kinds of frogs and birds and habitats, and it's a whole new world out there. So I hope that you've signed up to Twitter, and the next step is building a profile. So how do you go about building a presence online? Well, there are many things that you can do for that, and some of these are sort of general things that you should probably be doing if you're a scientist or someone in STEM, and that is, you can write, you can talk about your interests, and you can talk about your research. And in doing so, you can build communities around yourself and build networks that will help you in reaching those audiences, but also it will increase your chances of getting opportunities to communicate science. Now, when I first started out, I didn't join Twitter with the intent of becoming a science communicator. It's something that accidentally happened because I will talk about science to anyone and everyone. So basically, I'm a professional scientist whose hobby is also science. Just talking about science. So yeah, that's a bit sad, isn't it? But the main thing is, what I was surprised by was that because I was revealing a side of scientists as being, scientists are ultimately very ordinary people. We're everyday people. We have families and lives and gardens and dogs and cats and whatnot. And I think people don't necessarily see that. They tend to think of someone like Albert Einstein or Brian Cox. And so by being on Twitter, you're already increasing the diversity of perception of scientists. And you're also putting your research out there. Twitter is a fantastic way of developing networks and collaborations with other scientists. There are so many now that you can communicate with scientists from other fields or your own field. You can have access to conferences that you might not otherwise have had access to. And the other interesting thing is that you can actually find opportunities and places to write. There's a lot of new media startups apart from traditional mainstream media, and a lot of them are definitely keen for content, and they want to produce interesting, novel content, op-eds, and so on. And they want to have good, accurate information if they can. And so if you're available to provide expert comment, that is something that journalists really look for. Because it's not necessarily easy to figure out who you can talk to about a particular topic. So that was something that I found to be incredibly useful, and especially if it comes to new early establishment media platforms, they will often work with you, and so you can kind of support each other as you grow, as you write and become a better writer. Oh, and that's the other thing. Twitter is really good for your writing. It helps you to condense ideas. It helps you to explain concepts more simply and rather in simpler language. But it also really forces you to think about what you're doing in your research. And I found it really surprisingly helpful during my time in grad school in that way. But the other thing that's kind of sprung up online is things like Twitter journal clubs. And you can have access to other people, to mentors, to other institutions you wouldn't otherwise necessarily have such easy and simple access to. So there are a huge range of benefits to being on Twitter. So what are the other tricks for being on Twitter? Well, apart from writing a lot, where you can also write your own blog if you like and link it to Twitter, you can write Twitter threads, and it's really great because now you can link all of them and then you can unroll it so it turns into blocks of text. As you know, when I was starting out, it was like 17 tweets and they weren't connected to each other, and you'd hope that people just saw it in the timeline in order. It helps you in your science practice, it helps you in building networks, and it can also get you jobs. And from my own personal experience, my last job where I was working in New Zealand, I got through a Twitter contact who had also actually become an unexpected mentor. One of the other great things about Twitter, though, is that you can have conversations that you wouldn't normally have. And these conversations tend to be much broader than the ones that we have when we're in the lab or, you know, hanging out with your lab mates and in academia. And these conversations concern the broader implications of science and medical research and, you know, STEM generally. And it means that people can talk to you and that you can talk to other experts about these, but it will also broaden your understanding of how science fits into the world. And this is actually really important now. And as I mentioned before, we live in an age of quite invasive technology that, you know, concerns everything to the point that, you know, there are AI algorithms that are, you know, processing all of your images and on other social media platforms and so forth, and all of this facial recognition work that's going on. So all of these things have social implications and they affect you as well. And what you'll learn is that there are a whole bunch of issues out there that you would not otherwise be exposed to or be able to learn from without having Twitter as this sort of easy place to find the conversations that are happening. And in that process, it means that you have to accept that science has a political element to it, that we can't separate ourselves from a society, and what we do does also affect society. From the building of weapons to how quickly we can make a vaccine and whether that vaccine is available to all. And you'll find that Twitter will then broaden your understanding of science's place in the world. And it's often the case that these discussions then filter into academia, and if you're really lucky, over time they filter into much faster academic change than you would see otherwise. So, what are the easiest and most important rules about communicating on Twitter? Respect your audience is number one. Understand your audience, target your message to that audience. But the most important thing is you've got to remember that people are actually really smart and they're really interested in what you have to say. So if you explain a scientific concept in a way that reduces jargon, or maybe you'll explain the jargon, and you give them a full picture of the research that you're doing, and I don't know about you, but I'm really bad at metaphors, so I tend to stick to the explanation side. You'll find that people are actually fascinated by what you do, from the most mundane things that you do in the lab. I used to tweet about just doing cell culture, and this is something that people are not familiar with, and so you'll be surprised that even the most mundane things that you do are interesting and informative, because, I mean, you know, no one really goes home and harvests cells like that, you know, or puts them in a centrifuge. So respect your audience and understand that they will know when they're being spoken down to, but also that they will appreciate what you're saying and what you're doing. The other thing I would suggest is engage as much as possible and build trust. Now, your time is your own, as always, but a lot of people will be asking questions in good faith, and a lot of people will not be asking questions in good faith. But most people will respect you for attempting to answer questions that they might present to you. And that is really important. This establishment of trust through engagement, and also in honesty. Like if you don't know the answer to a question that they ask, it's totally okay to say that you don't know, because then they understand that you're sincere. And that's really, really important as well. The other thing to remember is that you don't just have to stick to science on Twitter. Now, you can definitely do that if you want. What you do on social media is entirely up to you and how much you want to invest in it. But one way of reaching new audiences, and since that is, you know, one of our goals in joining Twitter, is that you can talk about other stuff. You can talk about your other hobbies and other interests, and in doing so you end up building communities and networks of your own, and you also build up an audience of your own. And when you do that, you can start inserting bits of science into their timelines again, and you'll be surprised at the kind of response that you will get. Now, I personally found that to be an amazing opportunity to meet people, to meet other people in other professions that I was interested in, for example, writers and journalists and politicians. But what really surprised me was that I found that there were a lot of arts, humanities people, a lot of writers who started following me and became interested in science because they hadn't considered it from, say, different aspects before. But what really hit home was when I was invited to speak at writers' festivals. And these are like your average writers' festival where, you know, prestigious authors, novelists will turn up. These are literary events, and they have increased the number of science-related subjects and panels and so forth. And the participation of scientists in not just science panels, but in other panels like women in STEM and diversity and representation and so on. So bit by bit, you'll find that opportunities increase and audiences increase, and the kinds of audiences that you end up will also change. So it was a real privilege to be able to speak to these audiences that I wouldn't otherwise be able to talk to, and to talk to them about science. But really, I guess the other interesting thing was that I found that I was also able to talk on radio quite frequently as well. So we have the equivalent of the BBC in Australia is the ABC, and they have started recruiting scientists from Twitter to do podcasts and give talks, and also to participate weekly in science programs that talk about the week's science news. It's called, you know, like Research Filter on Radio National. So you'll find that in building a profile and engaging and reaching out, and also just being a person, you'll find that you can pick up opportunities to speak to non-traditional audiences that you might not otherwise have had. So finally, we come to Real Scientists. Real Scientists is a rotation curation account. Now, what a rotation curation account is it's a Twitter account where the person who tweets on that handle changes every week. And it kind of started off many years ago. One of the most famous ones was the Sweden account. So rather than having, say, a social media manager for Sweden, Sweden decided to have a different tweeter or curator every week, and that would be a different Swedish citizen every week. And it was amazing because it showcased the diversity of the people of Sweden, and it was a really interesting way of promoting a topic, promoting a country, but also to see, again, breaking down barriers and stereotypes. So Twitter can do that for scientists as well. So while a few of us were talking about science on Twitter, a friend of mine ended up curating on the New Zealand version of the Swedish rotation curation account, and that was called People of New Zealand. And this friend of mine was a scientist, and our mutual friend said, well, why don't you make a science curation account? And so we took that idea and ran with it, because what is what better way can we have to bring more science to more people, and to have different kinds of science available for people to see. So it's not going to be just astrophysics, or it's not going to be just marine biology. It's like every week there'll be someone different, and they'll have a different background and different research, and so on. But the other thing that we wanted to do was to showcase the different kinds of careers that you can have with a science degree, because there are people who don't go into lab work or research at all, and may go into, say, policy, if you're interested in influencing policy and funding and regulatory issues. But the other thing that was interesting is that we had scientists who would run for Congress or for Parliament. We had scientists who had not started out with a science degree, but in an entirely different profession. For example, we've had people who started in advertising and ended up in science, and people who were makeup artists and became fascinated by ecology and ended up as ecologists in science. And I think what I really appreciate about what's happened with Real Scientists as it's grown over the years is that it showcases the huge variety of careers, but also the kinds of backgrounds of people who end up in science. And it's thrilling and it's beautiful to see. So we're at the point now, I think, of about, I think it must be, 250 curators now. And the other thing is that we have perfect gender parity. There are times when we just have women tweeting for 3 months in a row, just by accident, and it's really wonderful. But another thing I really kind of want to point out is that Real Scientists is about certainly getting the science out there and invading people's timelines with, really fun science. But as I said before, being on Twitter means that you end up having discussions and awareness of issues that you might not previously have access to or understanding of or been able to take the time to research. So science policy, science and politics, those are some of those issues. The other thing to remember is that science is a part of society. So last year, when the Black Lives Matter protests were occurring, we were amazed to see how curators who had signed up at the beginning of the year say, we would actually really like for you to have Black scientists come and curate. If you need to have that space available, we're happy to postpone our years. And this was awesome because we really wanted to have Black scientists basically take over tweeting. And so people voluntarily gave up their times, their scheduled times for this. And that just shows how important it is. And we were very lucky to be able to work with, for example, Black in neuroscience, Black in mammalogy, Black in physics, and so on. And what that did was that it showed people the diversity of people in science. And it also helped us in the sense that it meant that it encouraged people from different backgrounds to sign up in a way that they hadn't before. And I'd put out many call-outs to people to say, look, we'd really love to have more diverse curators. And this really was the impetus. And we really want to see that sort of encouragement and empowerment happening within science and within the community. So Real Scientists provides a platform for scientists to communicate, provides a platform for the public to ask questions about science, and sometimes you can even send in requests. But it also provides information. It can be responsive to events, and it just showcases diversity in a way that I'd really like to see it happen on TV. If there was a way of converting this to a TV show, I would do that. So I think in many ways, Real Scientists has enabled us to reach audiences that we haven't reached before. But it's also been a fantastic resource for scientists. and many scientists have found it useful as part of their communication practice. They've found mentors, and they've found collaborators, they've found jobs, and they've found alternate careers from tweeting on real scientists, because it's also a really good central meeting point for other scientists. So if you're interested, please come and sign up. We'll put a link up for you at the end. So I guess in conclusion, I just wanted to say that thank you for listening. Remember that Twitter provides you with an opportunity to communicate with people about your work, and you will find that in doing that, you'll be able to encourage people into STEM, and you'll also improve your own STEM practice. So again, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.